Evan Fales, welcome to. Well, I should ask. I should ask. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
It is Fales.
Fales. Okay, that would have been
Yes,
a bad foot to start out on. Okay.
it was originally Fales, but now it's Fales.
Oh, all right. Well, good, good. So I was right. Evan Fales, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited.
Of course, we're talking today about Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. It's kind of a mouthful. So, to break it down, what is naturalism as a metaphysical thesis? And what are the very broad contours of evolutionary theory? I want to begin real big picture. So that's my first question to you.
Well, I mean, it's a good place to start. Um, Plantinga says that for his purposes, he will regard naturalism as the view that um, there are no gods, there's no God or anything like a God. And then he makes that a bit more precise in another statement where he says that naturalism is a commitment to the position that there are no disembodied minds. So I take it that being relevantly like God includes, among other things, being a disembodied mind. Um, and I rather like that definition. It's fairly narrow, it's fairly precise, and I think it is worth pointing out that it is fairly generous, if I may put it that way. Um, and this is useful to me because I suppose it's fair to say, as you'll see in a minute, that I'm not exactly your garden variety naturalist. um, so that's the first thing to say. Then you asked about uh, evolution, and here we presumably mean the current neo-Darwinian synthesis of a theory that includes not only Darwin's work but a great mass of subsequent research that has been a continuation of investigation of this Darwinian set of ideas. In fact, I hope that there will be time for me to, when we get to talking about evolution a little bit more precisely, to introduce some findings that I think were not available at the time when Plantinga wrote his paper and then his book about where the conflict really lies. Uh, so to give you just a little bit of background with respect to my views, so that people know sort of where I'm coming from and where I'm not coming from. Uh, I I think in the first place we need to distinguish naturalism as Plantinga understands it, and as I understand it, from materialism or physicalism, as it is sometimes called. Plantinga's way of specifying what a naturalist is actually consistent with one being a Cartesian dualist, um, with the proviso that one doesn't accept Descartes' view about life of the mind after death, right? And even that is somewhat problematic, as we may have occasion to revisit, because Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 uh, makes it less than clear whether the resurrected person has a body or not. So even that is up for grabs here. I'm not committed to materialism. Plantinga mistakenly thought that I was an epiphenomenalist, and I'm not. I've never been attracted to epiphenomenalism. For my money, um, the most plausible views on the market today are dualism, substance dualism, property dualism, interactionism of some kind. Um, and so I have a sort of a different way of approaching these matters. I don't think that the mind body problem has been solved. In fact, as far as I know, it doesn't seem to be close to having a solution. And this is a problem not just for materialists, but for theists as well, because it bears directly on explaining how it is that non physical things um, get involved with physical things. Okay. So I also am not committed to methodological naturalism. I think that's a huge mistake. And I don't appeal to anything of that sort, either in my way of understanding the Bible or my way of understanding science or much of anything else. It's not that I don't think that there are strong reasons to be a naturalist, even strong reasons to be a materialist. It's that those are not presuppositions. Those are not, for me, something like foundational principles or things that somehow are impenetrable by scientific investigation.
And would you mind saying what is methodological naturalism?
Methodological naturalism is distinguished from ontological or metaphysical naturalism in that it makes no commitment one way or the other whether there are things other than whatever is counted as natural things, material things in particular. Makes no commitment about that. But it argues that when you're doing science, you are confined to methods of inquiry that are inappropriate for and have nothing to tell us about immaterial things like divine beings and so on. Now, I'm not only am I not a methodological naturalist, my ontology includes all sorts of things that materialists would, or many of them would repudiate. Um, for example, um, I accept the libertarian position of free will. I accept realism with respect to normative properties and, in particular, with respect to morality. I'm a Platonist with respect to abstracta such as numbers, propositions, and universals. Okay, so and the list goes on a ways, but that I think serves to illustrate I'm within the confines of Plantinga's definition of a naturalist, but I am someone who, for philosophical reasons, um, accepts a lot of things that a lot of naturalists do not accept.
You probably have a lot of affinity for Michael Huemer. Those are many of his positions as well.
Yeah. Um, And I mean, I, of course, um, don't accept those things as sort of outliers or add ons. I think that they are intimately connected to an evolutionary account of life. So, there.
So that I think is a good articulation of naturalism. It's really just this minimal thesis that there is nothing like God. There are no unembodied minds, which is compatible with our having an immaterial substance, a soul, a mind, so long as that mind is always embodied. So it's a very minimal claim. It's defined, but it's minimal. And that makes it all the more interesting that Plantinga argues that this very, very general worldview will entail self defeat when combined with evolutionary theory. So it's one thing to argue that a very specific viewpoint entails something, but then a whole family of views encompassed by this very generous definition of naturalism will result in self defeat. That's a very strong claim. So that gives us an idea of what naturalism is. What's a nutshell statement of evolutionary theory? What does it propose?
Well, as I suppose we all know, fundamentally, um, Darwin was uh, was inspired by an idea that goes back to the to Greek philosophy, actually to the Greek atomists, and was taken up not that long before Darwin was on the scene by David Hume, namely the notion of random variation and natural selection. So that by itself is not an entirely new idea, but Darwin was the one that who was able to assemble an enormous mass of um, data from his knowledge of natural history to provide evidence that this was in fact a process that was operative in and explains uh, the nature of the development of species, living species. Nowadays, I might add, there is a great deal of activity in the area of research on anabiogenesis, or abiogenesis, I should say. Um, that is, it has been a fairly frequent claim on the part of um, theists that even if Darwin's theory has something to say about the evolution of life, it has nothing to say about the initiation of life. That's no longer a claim that can be made. Current theories about the earliest forms of molecular self reproduction are precisely ones that involve variation and selection. So I think we're not fully there yet in terms of having a fully fleshed out view, but we are well on the road to having such a view.
Okay. So, I mean, really, the idea for our purposes doesn't have to be spelled out in too much detail. It's that in a population, there are random genetic mutations that occur. Most of them are going to be harmful or neutral, but every so often there will be a genetic mutation that results in an adaptive advantage, some sort of beneficial mutation. And the member or members that have those mutations will outproduce the members that do. They'll survive and pass on their genes with a greater frequency than others. And so that trait will become dominant in the population. And you can extrapolate from that very general idea to all of life, is what neo-Darwinism proposes, that all of the variety of species and kinds, every aspect of the animal kingdom arises through this process of slow variation and increased survivability, survival of the fittest. So That I think is the key insight. I mean, that's what Plantinga built his argument on, that survivability is what evolution selects for. So with those two planks in place of naturalism and evolution, we can talk about Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. This will be the contention that anyone who believes both evolution and naturalism will acquire a defeater, or in some sense, a refutation of their original belief in evolution and naturalism. So it's in that sense self refuting. It could well be true, naturalism and evolution could still be true for all Plantinga says, but it can't be rationally affirmed. So, what is Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism?
Well, I should say a first move that he makes is, in fact, to argue that um, most naturalists are materialists, and that it is, as it were, a kind of a natural view, the natural view for someone who is a naturalist. So his argument in the end is actually directed toward physicalist interpretations of Darwinian theory. And so that's the first thing I think to notice. And then the argument proceeds by um, uh, making use of a research program among evolutionists and evolutionary biologists and naturalist philosophers of trying to show how natural selection actually works, with the idea that since natural selection is a physical process, the only thing that it can directly affect is the physical makeup of organisms. And that includes those systems in an organism that control its behavior and its ability to reproduce and so on. And those are, of course, complicated, but they are all physical processes that involve, among other things, a nervous system which is wired in certain ways and reacts to the environment in certain ways. But as Plenia wants to emphasize, while natural selection um, can, as it were, reward um, a physiology that is conducive to reproduction and survival, it has no it has no way of influencing belief. If belief is not reducible to facts about the physical makeup of an organism, then it, as it were, floats free. He also has an argument um, to try to show that even if mental states are identical to physical states of the brain, that what evolution, so to speak, cares about is not the mental content of those states, but the physical capacity of the organism to react to its environment in a way that promotes survival and reproduction. So that, in a sort of very general way, is the sort of argument that he is making, and it hinges on this distinction between these syntactical processes of an organism and semantical processes. So the thought is that beliefs have a semantics, they have a content, a mental content. Um, and if that content is in a way present in a living being, it must be encoded in some kind of physical embodiment. And so, like a computer, our brains operate on something like, you know, uh, bits like zeros and ones that, in and of themselves, have no content other than the content we ascribe to them. And therefore, uh, in themselves, insofar as their generation and modification um, is attuned to survival, has nothing by itself to do with content. And so there's no reason to believe that even if behavior can reliably negotiate an environment, that it has any bearing on the truth value of truths that sort of come along for the ride in an organism that is capable of having beliefs. That's. I hope I've been fair to the way that argument essentially works.
I think so. I think so. The key premise of the argument, I think, is that if the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism and evolution, is low. That's the really key premise, at least for me. And that's what you're talking about, is that if we assume a naturalistic evolutionary process, the likelihood or the probability that our cognitive faculties like memory or sense perception or intuition, the way in which we can tell if an argument is valid and understand the laws of logic, the probability that those cognitive faculties would issue in true beliefs given this naturalized evolution is low. And what you're saying, I think, is that the idea is that the content of our beliefs, what it is that we believe, isn't something that evolution can affect. It can only select for advantageous behavior, but it has no way of directly selecting for advantageous beliefs. It's kind of like, as long as you are running away from the bear that's trying to eat you, you will survive and outcompete people that don't run away, even if you don't believe it's a bear. You might believe that it's a bowl of soup or something, and you just
That's right.
hate soup a lot. It's a silly example, but it at least solidifies the point that evolution can only select for your behavior. The content or the actual things that you believe just don't enter the equation. And so that's why Plantinga says that the likelihood that you would end up just by chance alone with cognitive faculties that issue in true beliefs rather than just survivable behavior is low. So,
Right.
and
That's
there are
that's.
other ways.
I was just going to say the proviso there is that you can run faster than the bear, and you can run faster than any of your friends who happen to be with you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And then, of course, there are other steps of the argument to get to self-refutation. Then, once you realize that the probability that your cognitive faculties are reliable is low, well, then you acquire a defeater, a reason for doubting every single product of those cognitive faculties, every belief you have. But then, of course, your belief in evolution and naturalism is a product of those cognitive faculties. And therefore, you acquire a reason to doubt your belief in evolution and naturalism. And so, in this way, the position is self refuting. And I think you can respond to that
Yeah.
argument at each step of the way. But I take it your objections will center around that very first step, the argument for thinking that our cognitive faculties are probably unreliable if naturalized evolution is true. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. I mean, depending on how much time we have, what I have in store, and you're absolutely right, a central piece of that is to defend Darwinian evolution against the charge that it, so to speak, doesn't care about the truth value of our beliefs. So that's a kind of a head on criticism. Um, uh, I also have up my sleeve a number of defeaters for theism, some of which are self defeaters of theism. Um, so I don't know in this case that the best defense is an offense, because in philosophy you might both be wrong, but it carries some weight, I think. I think the first observation I want to make, though, is this. Suppose that Plantinga convinces me that he's got a good argument. Sounds like a pretty strong argument. What am I, a poor naturalist, to do as a reaction to that argument? I mean, should I, fold up my tent, so to speak, and go home, or are there other rational options that I have? And it seems to me that there are more rational options that I do have. The Of course, one of the options I have is to take the argument seriously, consider what the likelihood is that there's some error in the argument, even if I haven't found the error, um, and weigh that against the likelihood of there being some error of an internal sort in what I believe about evolution, et cetera, et cetera. Because what I'm doing really is weighing alternative possibilities here with respect to some very broad notion of overall likelihood. The second point to make is that it can be perfectly rational, in fact, is rational, and is, I think, good scientific method for people to hang on to theories, beliefs that face a great deal of a great deal of counter evidence, evidence that on the face of it looks to be self-defeating. And in fact, science does operate that way. Um, uh, New theories evolve, and there are people that think that they're betting, let's put it that way, they're betting that in the end, their older theory will be vindicated against whatever objections have arisen. And sometimes that does happen. And it's a good thing, I think, that there are people who, as it were, resist um, lightly changing or rapidly changing their long held and previously successful views. So it's not at all clear to me that the naturalist ought to simply abandon naturalism unless they become fully convinced that Plantinga's argument is a sound argument. Well, so is it a sound argument? That is the question. Um, Now, there are, uh, in fact, as Plantinga is well aware, there are efforts on the part of naturalists to understand content on a physicalist uh, platform, so to speak. And those like Ruth Millikan's and so on are fairly complex and fairly sophisticated. Plantinga thinks that they don't work. I am not of a settled opinion about that, but I do think that there are features of those views that remain to be properly sorted out. Some of those features are features that the theist has got, as far as I can tell, just as much of a problem with or more of a problem with. Intentionality, for one. Um, the the For me, the one of the most fundamental facts of the structure of mental acts is that they have this act object structure where there is something like an attention, an awareness directed toward a content. The content doesn't have to actually exist. That's another interesting feature of intentionality. And the question is, how do we understand that structure? Now, um, my naturalist colleagues are working hard on that. I have been working hard on it for years. I think it's an extremely difficult problem. I don't know if we ever will solve it. But it remains for me to hear from theists any substantive theory about how it is that God creates things that have consciousness. It is often said, well, only God can do it because he's an intelligent designer and he has consciousness. But that's not an explanation. That's just to say somehow he does it. And so I'm really, it's not just that theists tend not to have a really contentful explanation, let alone one that proposes ways that we can go about testing it. It's that it seems to me, by and large, that they don't really have a story to tell at all. And until they get such a story, I find it a little bit difficult to know how to assess their claim. I think there are some reasons for resisting the view that God is able to impart on other beings what we call original intentionality. Um, that is to say, purposes and things like intentional acts of consciousness that are not um, attributed by way of imputation. So I can build a computer and it can do things. And it can do things that look like purposive activity, depending on how I program it. But the purposes are not the computer's purposes. They're my purposes. It acts as an instrumental means that I have. I don't know how to create something that has its own purpose or set of purposes. And I don't know how God would do that either. So that's one big caution in my approach to these issues right from the start. um, okay, so a lot does hinge on whether there are ways to connect up um, the beliefs that people have with their behavior that are mediated by their bodies, by embodiment, and that is, of course, a central problem, a central issue in the mind-body problem. And as I said, I don't have a solution to that problem. I have some suggestions to make, but I don't think anybody else has a solution to that problem either. So it seems to be a kind of an equal footing there as such matters go. Moreover, I wouldn't call them properly basic beliefs at all, but I do have a massive amount of evidence to suggest to me that having the right beliefs makes my life better. And it makes my life better because my beliefs have an effect on my actions. I don't have the ontology to support that. What I do have is a massive amount of apparent correlation, which Plantinga will argue is a belief about my beliefs that has been produced by cognitive faculties that I have some reason to doubt. At this point, I think the question of internal defeat hangs on whether a an ongoing project of developing uh, the neo-Darwinian view leads to a kind of internal incongruity or inconsistency, or whether it doesn't. And as long as um, it can begin to address the question whether the likelihood of my beliefs being true is small or improbable, it looks as if we have a going enterprise. Now, somewhat peculiarly, Plantinga says, look, uh, there's no necessary connection. There's no uh, even probabilistic connection that we can understand between our beliefs and our mental states. So, for any belief that I have, the prior probability should be 50-50. That, I think, is the wrong question actually to ask, though it serves its purposes. The, the question is, what is the probability that I will have a true belief that is relevant to um, directing my behavior? That is, a true belief that is, under the circumstances, useful, or a belief that, even if it isn't strictly true, is somehow connected to the truth in ways that give me information about how to act. The question of how my intentions to act in certain ways translate into bodily behavior, and how, on the reverse route, so to speak, bodily episodes enlighten my mind, is something that remains to be determined. So far, I don't see how Plantinga has established uh, something stronger than the, um, the, the fact that everybody, I think, acknowledges, which is that we don't have an adequate explanation of how mental processes and beliefs are created in our minds.
Hmm. So I like this idea that there's parity between theism and naturalism here, and I want to explore that for a bit. I take it that your basic response, your first point you made, was that insofar as we're trying to understand how intentionality or our beliefs being about other things, I believe that I graduated from the fifth grade and entered middle school. That there, my belief is about middle school and my graduation. It has intentionality, an intentional object, middle school. How does that arise in a naturalistic world? How do you get these things, these beliefs that have intentionality? That's incredibly mysterious because normal, ordinary physical objects like a cup or a desk or a computer, they're not about other things. They just are. They don't have this intentionality or object directedness.
Mhm.
And so the point you make is yes, it is a mystery, but it's also a mystery on theism. How is God able to create beings like us that have
That's right.
intentionality, that
That's
have
right.
beliefs? You could
Yeah.
even make it more specific and say, even if we have a soul, and that's the seat of consciousness, this immaterial mind, how is it that an immaterial mind can have intentionality? It doesn't seem any less mysterious. But I wonder if you're really isolating the problem that Planting is getting at. On the surface, that to me seems like a different problem that's just at a orthogonal to what planning is talking about. Because for planting, the issue is our beliefs, not how intentional beliefs could arise in the first place, but how we could have a reason for thinking those intentional beliefs are true. And so the difference between naturalism and theism would be that theism can ascribe a guiding force to the evolutionary process so that the cognitive faculties we end up developing are largely reliable, whereas naturalism can't do that. And it doesn't seem to me that that issue is directly reducible to the more general mind body problem. How does mind arise? How do intentional objects like beliefs arise? That seems to me to just be a more general different issue. Have I misunderstood?
Well, they are intimately connected because how reliable you think something is in performing a certain job depends on how much you know about how it works, right? Um, and I don't know, for example, how it works that God has knowledge of the world if he is a disembodied mind. I mean, he doesn't have sense perception, right? And of course, there are theories going back to the medieval ages about how that's supposed to work, but I don't find them very plausible. Um, so once again, we're on a par here, and the challenge to the naturalist is to begin to try to understand enough about the processes of belief formation to give us some internal evidence that indeed they are likely to produce uh, true beliefs, or beliefs that, if not literally true, are ones that can guide action in a way that makes for survival. Now, in fact, I want to mention a book that I recently came across. It was published 4 years ago by a philosopher of biology that takes up precisely that challenge. And it's a difficult book to read because unless you're trained in evolutionary biology, but it's astonishing, I think, in some of its results. So I'll get into that here presently because I think that um, uh, there are at least ways that we have of progressing toward that particular goal of seeing how evolution does this. Uh, okay. Um, I also want here to say I think that one of the one of the epistemological commitments that I have that I think is not regularly invoked when people think about these matters, philosophers think about them, um, that I think has to play a major role is our experience of causation. My view is that Hume was wrong, and that we do have immediate, direct experience of non accidental connections between events. And they are of several types. There are the physical causal ones, and there are ones that are not physical and causal, that are connections between thought contents. We have an ability, we have certain innate knowledge, if you will, or knowledge that we get by simple self examination. I'm very much a Cartesian about this. Uh, we know what we're thinking. We know that we are thinking A because we thought B and because we recognize that B entails A. It's not a causal connection, but it's a non accidental connection. So reasoning is not a causal process, although it might be, as it were, undergirded by some sort of causal process. That, as you can begin to guess, has something to do with my views about free will. Um, now, the reason I mention this is because if you think that causation can be shown to be both what Locke would call a primary and a secondary quality, right? It's something we have a representation of that actually we have good reason to believe is, as it were, out there operating in the world as well. Then, if you also accept some kind of a causal theory of reference, you've got the ability to establish reference to things that are part of the noumenal world, that are out there. And I won't go into the details here about that, but the idea is that if I can take a certain assemblage of effects and rationally attribute them to a single cause, then I have a way of identifying or isolating that cause. That, I think, is not by itself a refutation of skepticism, but it's a big step. Um, so, as I said in an email to you, the problem branches out into all kinds of other issues that really have to be considered before we can come to um, a considered position of where we stand on this particular issue. Now, let me come to this argument by Russell Powell, in a book called Contingency and Convergence. The book challenges Stephen Jay Gould's famous declaration that evolution works in random ways, and asks the question whether, given all the randomness that there aren't certain more or less overall trends that are not random, but that work in similar directions. And he makes the argument that consciousness is something that seems to have that feature. Now, getting the empirical support for this is complicated, but it involves what's called convergent evolution. If we have evidence that animal organisms whose common ancestry goes back to before the Cambrian period, to the Ediacardian period, for example, when all we had was non-mobile multicellular blobs, then we can, and if we find that evolution has independently produced certain ways of interacting with the environment, then we have something that is that prompts an interesting set of reflections. Now, what Powell shows is that, among other things, ways of locating ourselves in a surrounding space and locating other objects in that surrounding space have evolved in completely independent ways using independent mechanisms. Vision has evolved several times independently. Echolocation has evolved separately, independently several times. Electrical field location has as well. So there are a number of these, and together with proprioception and our vestibular organs that tell us, the direction of gravity, essentially, we have these independent inputs that tell us something about what Powell calls our Umwelt. That is to say, we have an internal representation of ourselves as being spatially located in a surrounding space, essentially, Euclidean space for all practical purposes, that we are able to reconstruct. And our ability to do this is something that he thinks requires a sort of a single processing center that can recognize the underlying isomorphisms between these different ways of detecting location. So you can represent a Euclidean space by using, coordinate numbers for every point in the space, or every point in every pixel in the space. But for computational processing, that's not at all efficient. Let me give you a couple of examples that I think can demonstrate uh, how that's the case. So take a Rubik cube, right? There are people, as you know, that can take a Rubik cube, look at it for a few seconds, and then be blindfolded and solve it within something like a minute. Okay? If they had to do that by processing numerical coordinates, I don't know how that would go. What they have is an understanding of the spatial relations between the parts of the Rubik cube that they can rotate mentally in such a way as to gain information that leads to a solution to the problem. And Powell argues that that sort of thing is what consciousness does. It solves what he calls the binding problem. Hume thought that we actually operate with different spaces, an auditory space and a visual space and an olfactory space and so on, and that we just look for correlations between them, but that's not how it seems to go. So just to tease you a little bit with some intriguing results that are worth thinking about, it turns out that the spiders that have the best eyesight are jumping spiders. They have both compound eyes, like insects do, with lots of little eyelets in there, and also camera eyes like ours. They are very good at stalking prey. They are very good at outsmarting prey. They're good at recognizing their orientation to the prey and trying to sneak around behind the prey, understanding where the prey is looking. They use stalking techniques the way a cat does, stopping when they feel their motion might be detected. We can take such a spider and position it above a maze, which it is going to have to run. The maze has a reward, a prey animal, an insect, in the box at the center, and it has. I haven't actually seen a picture of these mazes. I don't know how many possible routes they have, but they have a route that looks like it's going directly toward the reward, but ends in a dead end, and a route that takes a long detour, but actually gets you to home plate. The spider can see all this from above because the maze doesn't have a top. The spider is put at the entryway of the maze where it can't see the layout anymore, and most of these spiders solve the maze without making an error. It seems as if they have something like an object representation of themselves as moving in a Euclidean space vis-a-vis certain places where they can move and places where they can't move. Now, as I say, Powell doesn't solve the mind-body problem. He doesn't pretend to solve the mind-body problem. But when you begin amassing huge amounts of data of this sort among mammalian species, insect species, um, mollusks like octopi and so on, who don't have any close ancestry at all. Um, Consciousness sounds like a pretty good explanation for how these animals manage to navigate, but only if consciousness, number one, coughs up true beliefs or most true beliefs and is capable of deploying those true beliefs in ways that activate the right type of bodily movement. So the picture I have is, look, I know that I have certain a priori cognitive faculties that are reliable. I know that immediately. Even if I don't know exactly how the whole thing works, I certainly know that modus ponens is a valid argument. And I know that 1 + 1 = 2, and I know lots of things like that. I have a set of inferential faculties that, though they have limitations, are pretty good for a lot of purposes. And I have input, I have sensory experiences. And between my having the sensory experiences and my body actually moving, I engage very often in reasoning, sometimes long process of deliberation. And if I start with false beliefs, it's all bets are off with respect to whether the final belief I come up with is true or false. Could be either. There's absolutely no saying what it's going to be. But if I start with true beliefs and I only use legitimate forms of argument, then I have reason to believe that I, at the end of the process, have true beliefs. And if true beliefs are the sort of thing you want in order to survive, then consciousness is the sort of thing you want. If you want to navigate a complicated world, now the Ediocardian organisms were sessile. They by and large didn't move. They couldn't look for prey. They couldn't go hunting. As soon as they got eyesight, you have the Cambrian explosion, and suddenly you have predators and prey. It's an interesting thing to notice that as soon as animals became mobile, they began to have things that begin to look like true beliefs about their environment.
Well, okay. So let me connect this back to that first premise, because I think all of those observations about animal behavior and consciousness are probably right insofar as they show that a conscious awareness that produces behavior that results in a survival advantage, that goes to show that that kind of consciousness would itself be of a significant survival value. But it's still not clear to me that that story or that process requires those beliefs being true, that the consciousness issuing in or awareness issuing in true beliefs is required. It seems to me that Plantinga's point still holds, that all that really matters in the case of the jumping spider or predator prey relationships is that one's conscious awareness causes one to act in the right sort of way to avoid getting eaten or to find the prey. But it doesn't require that the organism in question has true beliefs. And so I think that's the really pivotal question. I mean, to return to just that simple example of running away from the bear, as long as my conscious awareness causes me to see things and have beliefs that result in me running away from the bear, it doesn't seem to matter that if I believe it's a bear or not, or something else entirely. So maybe you can say more that will connect the dots here. What's the connection to true beliefs?
Uh, it's that the processes that we know that we use to get from true beliefs to action go through, certainly in the case of human beings and intelligent animals, a process of reasoning. And that has to be controlled by truth value, or else it's useless. That's at the core of the argument. I have to have representations of the world at work. Let me take a simpler example than the Rubik's Cube. We all experience forces on our bodies, and these forces are important for us to respond to correctly when it comes to survival. I guess you would grant me that, right? The We experience forces. In fact, I think that's our fundamental experience of causings, and I think it can be analyzed phenomenologically to show that these are not accidental connections between getting pushed and the body reacting in a certain way. Okay, but forces are complicated, and you can be acted on by many forces at once. And the resulting force is, we know from Newtonian mechanics, a vector sum of the various forces. Now, so an animal has to be good at actually um, reckoning with vector sums if it's going to move at all and not just topple over. How does it how does it solve that problem? Unless it has some sort of a conception of direction.
It seems like what you might be getting at is a reply I once heard a while ago that while it's easy enough to point to specific cases where having a false belief could still result in the right kind of behavior, you would still survive. It's much more difficult to come up with a case where all of your beliefs are false almost all the time, where a large share, a majority of your beliefs are false, and all of your cognitive faculties are largely unreliable, and you still navigate all of life and survive. That's a much more complex story you'd have to tell, and it's far less plausible. You might run away from the bear in one instance, but it seems like in all likelihood, that cognitive faculty that made you misidentify the bear would at some other point in your life result in your demise. And so it's kind of like what you're saying about these forces. Things get very complicated very quickly when you're talking about navigating all of life and reproducing more successfully than other members of your cohort.
That's
Is
part
that
of that. That's sort of a basic intuition I have. And you have these octopuses that are presented with puzzles that are unlike anything they ever experience in their natural environment. And crows, for example, and they might try a few things, hit or miss, and then they realize it isn't easy. What they do is they kind of sit back and look at it for a few moments, and then they approach the puzzle again and they solve it like that. Uh, it's quite uncanny, right? I mean, they learn how to unscrew jar tops, for example. They don't have jars. There's a prey inside the jar that they want. They are able to perform these computations in ways that adjust to situations they've never seen before. And this requires, I think, more than just being conscious. It requires being able to take things like spatial shapes and perform mental rotations or other kinds of mappings of them within a larger space. In our case, we tend to think that we just get on our retinas a two-dimensional image of the world. And then how is it that we get not only a three-dimensional representation, but I have a representation of the back of your head, which I can't see now at all. Something takes care of that in there. Now, this is not to say that a lot of it isn't automatic. A lot of it is preconscious. There's a lot of processing that is preconscious and, in fact, is more adaptive if it is preconscious because it can often be faster. make more errors, but be faster. And sometimes time is of the essence, right? So we have knee-jerk sorts of reactions to things that happen before we really are thinking them through at all. That is a genuine phenomenon that I don't think anybody would deny. But but then we have the cases where we deliberate, and the crow ponders how to get it's sitting on a stick and there's a string tied to the stick that goes down a few feet to a piece of meat, and it's trying to figure out how to get the meat. And instead of randomly pecking it, looks at it for a while, and then reaches down as far as it can, picks up, grabs the string as far down as it can, brings the string up to the perch, puts a foot on it to hold that there, reaches down again, grabs another bite of string, pulls it up, puts its foot on that, and soon it has the meat. Right. Um, so I am, shall we say, not at the point where I feel compelled by Plantinga's arguments to think that um, some indeterminately large, potentially large number of my beliefs are false. Plantinga says, well, for any given belief, there's a 50-50 chance. And if you add up all of your beliefs, the chance that any substantial fraction of them, like 2/3, are true is infinitesimally small. That's not the right sort of calculus to use at all, as far as I can see, for reasons I've already mentioned, and because there are, as Graham Oppie points out, problems about how you count beliefs and all kinds of other. That's not I think, what goes on or would be um, very plausible. Now, if we have, maybe this is premature, but if we have time, I'd like to mention some internal defeaters for theism that I think are equally pernicious.
So
Indeed.
let's discuss these defeaters for theism. What is the corresponding version of the evolutionary argument against theism?
Well, these they're not corresponding exactly. Well, one of them sort of is, but they have this a similar structure. And I have 4 or 5 of these. Let me focus on 2 that I find particularly interesting. Um, one is a huge topic, actually. Uh, in his book, where the conflict lies, Plantinga mentions what he calls a number of superficial def- um, defeaters of theism, which he dismisses in fairly short order. And one of these is critical Bible scholarship. Um, this I find especially puzzling. Critical Bible scholarship has evolved over the course of more than 2 centuries now, and has amassed an almost unimaginable amount of information relevant to trying to understand the early history of Judaism and Christianity, among other things. Um, and it has come to involve somewhere around a dozen different scientific disciplines, from archaeology to carbon dating methods to paleography to all kinds of things. Um, and what Plantinga's approach is to quote some passages from a number of Bible scholars, mostly from nearly a century ago, um, who are uh, making methodological pronouncements to the effect that it is not within their purview as historians to consider the possibility of miracles, for example, or as Boltzmann once said, in our modern age, we can't even take seriously the possibility of miracles, etc. So they were rather dismissive. Now, first point I would make is that the practitioners of a particular discipline um, can be masters of that discipline, but fall short of mastery when it comes to making methodological generalizations about what it is that they're doing. And the historical circumstances in which Boltzmann and a number of other people have made remarks that Plantinga finds dismissive says very, very little about the actual work that has been done by virtue of Bible criticism. Now, Luther, Calvin, Arminius, and a number of the Protestant reformers who were committed to the doctrine sola scriptura found themselves um, in a position where they pretty much had to say, and did say, that scripture is always perspicuous, it's always clear, and if you read it in the right frame of mind, so to speak, you will understand what God means to be teaching us. That's a little bit hard to square, first with the fact that by that time, Christianity had already been around for 13, 14, 1500 years and had been all over the map. And not only all over the map, but at war with itself over how to understand an innumerable number of biblical passages. And the fact that there are disagreements among Bible scholars is not a surprise. There are disagreements among physicists about all sorts of things. But there are ways of finding evidence that is highly relevant to trying to decide these matters. Unfortunately, Bible scholarship is plagued paradoxically by too much information and too little information. Too much because there is so much now that I think no mortal can possibly control all of that information. So too little because there are all too many really blank spots where we have very little or very inadequate testimony or other sorts of evidence. We know very little about First Temple Judaism, for example. We have very, very little in the way of actual writings that tell us what was going on there. We have a very minimal independent historical evidence for the historicity of David, and essentially none so far for Solomon. There are these huge gaps where we have to try to reconstruct things in indirect ways. But the fact of the matter is that when I read the Bible, as I have for 60 years, there's not a page that goes by without me scratching my head and wondering what exactly is going on there. It is anything but perspicuous. It is a masterpiece of literature that is as deep and complex as any literature that I know. And it is extraordinarily difficult, I think, to come to definite conclusions about a lot of, I could, give you lots and lots and lots of examples where this is the case. But let me come to just a couple of instances where we have what Plantinga would call the great things of the Bible or the great things of the Gospels and so on. Plantinga takes it, I take it on scriptural authority, that God created the universe ex nihilo, out of nothing. And of course, the first verse of Genesis seems to say something like that. But in fact, the first verse of Genesis is linguistically complex. partly because Proto-Hebrew and Hebrew, the Old Hebrew, omitted the diacritical marks that told you what the vowels were. So I think there's a fairly widespread agreement among scholars now that that first verse goes, in the beginning, when God was creating the earth and the universe, there was darkness over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God flowed over the darkness and said let there be light, right? Was creating suggests that this particular version of the creation story is somewhat of a piece with other ancient Near Eastern Semitic creation stories, according to which there's a primal chaos waters. And what God does is create some order in that. I would go further, even further than John Walton, who thinks, I think correctly, that really what is going on here is not fundamentally or primarily a discussion of physical cosmogony, but of the creation of social order. That takes some careful scholarship to begin to unveil. But I would be prepared to defend that and to suggest that Genesis 1 is not about something that the ancients really had no business. They may have wondered about it, they may have speculated about it, but they certainly had no business, making creedal statements about it. A little bit later in Genesis 1:27, it says that God created man and woman in his image. He created them. And of course, Plantinga and most Christians take the Imago Dei to be an expression of the uniqueness of human beings, in particular their intelligence, their moral conscience, and various other features that place the divine imprimatur on us. Now, the Hebrew word for image is tselem. And outside of that context in the Old Testament, it always means wooden images of false gods. In the New Testament, of course, you have the language being Greek, and the Greek word is icon. And if you read the letters of Paul, you get some interesting, apparently disparate and hard to process claims by Paul, such as that because of original sin, we lost the image of God and we won't get it back until the resurrection, that the only human being that still had it was Jesus, and even that man was made in the image of God. This is in 1 Corinthians. Man was made in the image of God, but woman was made in the image of man. These are not clear and perspicuous statements. So the Bible itself is a defeater, I think, of many aspects of Christian faith in which people presume that they know what God's word is, and there's good reason from the Bible itself to believe that they do not. A particular case that has always interested me is the case of miracles. I use a very strong principle of charity in interpreting the Bible. So I think most of what it says is true, or at least rational for people to have believed. Would it have been rational for some Galilean fishermen to believe that somebody could walk on the water? No. So is there a way to preserve rationality? Well, why would you think that that story is meant literally? In particular, why would you think that it is meant literally when the theme of control over chaos waters, storm waters, goes back to Genesis 1 and God's moving over the waters of the deep, which are the Tselem, the chaos waters, and repeats itself in the Old Testament more times than I can count, including obviously Noah's flood, including the crossing of the Jordan River and the crossing of the Red Sea, including literally dozens of passages in the Psalms, including the book of Jonah, and so on and so on. There's even a passage in Job which speaks about God walking on the high waves of the storm waters. Why would I think that this is somehow meant literally, or that taking it literally even comes close to giving us a correct understanding of that story in the absence of thinking about this long Jewish tradition of mastery over chaos waters, when that tradition even tells you outright in Second Solomon what the chaos waters represent. This is a metaphor. So once again, now this is, of course, um, my best effort at interpreting not just this, but pretty much all the other miracle stories. Uh, it has to adhere to not just one's imagination, but to actually showing in detail how a certain message is being spelled out in a way that is relevant to the context and purpose of the gospel stories. So it's not as if it's sort of Freudian free for all, just coming up with things in your imagination. But whether it's right or it's wrong, it seems to me that it illustrates just how hard the Bible stories are to get some sort of unproblematic grip on when you're in a culture that is 2,000 years older and has very different ways of thinking about things and very different languages and so on. The other case has to do with an argument that was put forward by originally by Steve Wickstra. It probably goes further back. I know it goes further back. Called the no-seum argument.
Oh yes. Before you go into that though, I wanted to comment here on the first argument that I'm not sure that this amounts to a self-refuting point to be made against theism. That theism suffers from an internal contradiction or incoherence or probabilistic incoherence in the way Plantinga argues about naturalism, because at most these would be issues for the Christian theist that holds to a particularly strong view of biblical inerrancy and literalism. And that's the source of the problem about the Bible's divergent messages about various aspects of history and science and the core of Christian belief. But it wouldn't do anything to undermine the theistic beliefs of the Muslim or of the Hindu in certain sects of Hinduism, or of the deist, or of the philosophical theist who's convinced about God's existence based on philosophical argument. And it wouldn't seem to do anything to the Christian theist who doesn't hold to the inerrancy of the Bible. So that doesn't show that your argument is wrong, but it shows it's far more modest in its claims, I think, than what Planting argues about naturalism. So it's not quite like parallel in that way.
You're quite correct. I mean, it is it is a problem for Christian theism, and not just for people that interpret the Bible literally, but people that are presented with a book that requires a lot of head scratching altogether, whether you're a literalist or not. Um, but Planning himself has been vocal in suggesting that Christians ought to be prepared to make their claims on the basis of more than just bare theism. Right. So, but you're right. It is directed toward that, and to some extent, this other one is also directed toward a particular tradition that is, in fact, deeply embedded in the Christian tradition, and not necessarily um, something that is accepted by anyone who is a theist of some kind. There are, there are. It clearly depends on what sort of a view you have when you commit yourself to atheism. The no-seum argument is a defense against the problem of evil to the effect that God is an infinite being, we are finite, and therefore we should not expect that our cognitive penetration of matters can even come close to approaching God's understanding of things. And so, therefore, if, for example, we come across a problem of horrible, we come across a case of horrible evil, and we just can't conceive of anything that would justify God's permitting that sort of evil. That's not an argument uh, that suggests that there isn't a God or that provides evidence for that. Because after all, God may know of goods that he means thereby to accomplish, which are far beyond what we can even imagine. So we shouldn't expect to be able to know God's justification, so to speak, his reasons for doing some of the things that we find on the face of it to be terribly evil. Um, it struck me when I read Wikstra that this was a dangerous move to make. And it independently struck Hudson, who has written a wonderful paper called Father of Lies, question mark. So if I really am fairly clueless, or perhaps completely clueless about all the goods that God is, weighing in the balance to decide what the best thing to do is, um, there are lots of things that I might not be able to exclude just because of my limited understanding. For example, maybe God devised Christianity as an enormous hoax on human beings for purposes that neither you nor I can imagine, but that are ultimately such as to justify such a hoax. Now, there's even some there are biblical passages that suggest that God is not above doing such a thing in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 20, for example, and Isaiah 55. Um, but whether or not you have some sort of hint at that sort of thing in the Bible, the fact is that if Wikstra is right, we have no good reason whatsoever for thinking one way or the other about whether Christianity is a hoax. That strikes me as, for Christianity at least, an internal defeater and a serious.
Mm. Yeah, it's one that has always bothered me about this family of views called skeptical theism that emphasize, as you say, our cognitive limitations in the face of evaluating whether a perfect being would or would not permit some horrific evil that we encounter. Most of those skeptical theses that they'll argue for seem unrestricted in their scope and issue in skepticism that goes way beyond the bounds of this or that evil, but would then, as you say, remove our ability to claim with any justification that God did not lie to us in the biblical text, for example, or in his revelation in Jesus of Nazareth. Maybe it's all just false, or this promise of an eternal afterlife is false, and that there is some great good that's brought about that we are unaware of by this hoax. But I don't have a good response to it because it bothers me as well about the implications of skeptical theism. I guess the trouble for me as a theist is then that I think our best shot of resolving the problem of evil is something along skeptical theistic lines. So it leaves me in a precarious position. I don't think the resolution of the problem of evil is going to be found by identifying the great good that is realized by all of the suffering in the world. I think it's pretty clear that we can't come up with one. So it's a tough one. I mean, what do skeptical theists usually say in response to this divine deception objection? I know a few lines of response that one might say that it's deontologically impermissible for God to deceive us. That while God can allow certain evils in order to bring about good consequences, he can't allow just anything. Namely, he can't allow things that are deontologically impermissible. I don't know about that line of response, but what would you take to that?
Well, I remember being in a conference at Notre Dame, and I actually don't remember the name of the gentleman, but it was one of our well-known Christian philosophers who made an argument to the effect that it was okay for God to deceive the Canaanites, but he would never, ever have deceived the Jewish people with whom he had a covenant. And I was in the audience, and I happened to have my Bible with me, and I did a little bit of leafing because I remembered some cases, and I confronted him with the cases, and I mean, he had nothing to say. Um, so, I mean, it looks as if either the Bible got it wrong or God got it wrong, and that's a tough dilemma to face. Um, And I mean, Ezekiel 20 has God saying that he gave the Jews bad laws to obey, by which they could not live. Right? I mean, now, and not only does he say that, he says you're not allowed to question me about it. It says you may not inquire. Now, so these are disturbing, and I don't know. I mean, one can say that God loves us, and we know that because He has revealed it to us. But of course, that would be about as efficacious as my saying as a naturalist that I know that my faculties are reliable because they reveal to me that they're reliable. Right? I mean, I have all sorts of empirical evidence that they're reliable. That's a very quickly closed circle. So I mean, I don't know. My advice is stay away from skeptical theism and its much older cousin apophaticism, which says that the only truths we can know about God are negative
Sure,
truths.
sure.
Don't touch them with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I don't have
I
much
think they're
patience for
really
it.
toxic.
Yeah, I don't have much patience for apophaticism in any like significant aspects of it, where it's a really significant thesis. So as we step back and wrap up, thinking about Planning's argument as a whole, what is the lesson that you would draw from the evolutionary argument against naturalism? I don't think that it's that naturalism plus evolution is self-defeating, but it's a fascinating little piece of philosophy that has generated a
It,
huge amount of literature and reflection. That means
yeah.
something. That means something. So
Yes.
what's the
Yes.
lesson of his of planning his work on this argument?
Well, I mean, Planning is a brilliant man. We've actually been friends for many years. um, I have the highest respect for him as a philosopher. Um, in this particular case, and in some others, I think he has been especially clever in taking trends that have appeared within um, the orbit of naturalist philosophizing and turned them against the naturalists. This is true of his externalist epistemology, his proper, his proper functioning epistemology. Externalism, um, I mean, it goes back to Reid or even further back, but planning to find sources of it in Calvin and Aquinas. But it had lately become popular among non-theistic philosophers. And he sees a way to weaponize it, so to speak, against them. And uh, the other case in point here is his weaponization of this attempt to uh, reduce um, reduce an understanding of human consciousness and cognition to a purely syntactic account in terms of brain synapses and so on. Um, I mean, and my response to that as well. I mean, that's all going beyond what we really understand now, and so I'm agnostic about that. I'm agnostic. I suspect that if there is a solution to the mind body problem, it would probably have a lot to say about this. But I suspect that if there is a solution to it, it will be one that has not yet been even remotely thought of yet. Something really radically new. I think, for example, that the as I mentioned before, I think we understand physical causation. We also understand reasoning as a kind of a necessary connection between mental events of a certain sort. And I think there are other such connections that we haven't really thought through yet, such as embodiment, which are not contingent, but they're not identity, and they're not a lot of other things that we might think of. And so I don't know if I will live long enough, but I wish I would. I would like to know what the answers here are.
Mm. Yeah, so do I. So do I. So I'm hopeful that through conversations such as this, we'll begin to figure it out. So,
I would like to say, by the way, and I mean this quite sincerely, that you and a number of other people that you and I can both probably easily think of are performing what, especially for American culture, is an extraordinarily valuable service,
thank you.
which is to stop shouting and to start thinking really hard about the things that divide us in a way that tries to acknowledge how hard the problems are and how modest we have to be in the claims that we make about what we know and what we don't know. I really, really appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. It is my goal is to the best that I can model a different way to have those conversations for people who even have the conversation in the first place is in good humor and charity to talk about these difficult things, but these important things, and to do it in a way that's productive rather than not. So I appreciate you saying that, and I thank you for coming on the podcast today and being a part of that. I think people will get something from this conversation. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. You can be sure.